Thank you very much indeed, General. May I preface my remarks by saying what a great honour it is to address you and your officers, and to thank you very much indeed, needless to say, for your service. Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, the great literateur, used to say that every Englishman despised himself for not having worn the scarlet, donned the king's scarlet, become a soldier. And certainly for somebody who, like me, has never been a soldier, it really is a tremendous honour to address people who've done something as magnificent as that. I think that when one looks at the concept of leadership in war, it's important to understand things that are not important, as well as those that are. And I'd just like to mention a few things that, that are not important in my view, or at least in my historical analysis. Excuse me. The first is, surprisingly, charisma. Charisma is a bit of a trick, frankly. It's an artificial construct. If, like Adolf Hitler, you have Leni Riefenstahl making your movies and Joseph Goebbels as your propaganda minister and Albert Speer organizing your rallies, then you can appear charismatic, even if personally, actually, there's nothing particularly charismatic about you at all. So, so it's important, I think, not to fall for that, what's been called a harlot's trick. The second thing is a sense of humour is always considered quite important. I disagree with this entirely. My great heroine of my life has been Margaret Thatcher, who had absolutely no sense of humour whatsoever. When you bumped into her at a drinks party, she would start off with conversational gambits such as, so Andrew, what do you think about the United Nations? It would be extremely off-putting, frankly. Whereas there are other people in history, I'm afraid Joseph Goebbels is an example, who are particularly evil and sinister figures, but actually had a rather good sense of humour. There was one occasion in 1945 when the war was going very badly for Germany, and he arrested all of the soothsayers and the palm readers and people who looked into crystal balls and so on. And he reported this to Hitler, and he said, and you know, mein Führer, none of them predicted it. So a sense of humour also is pretty unimportant. The capacity for oratory, which one would have assumed would also have been an epicentral prerequisite for a war leader, is also not that important either. Neither Napoleon nor Stalin were public speakers of any great note, and yet, of course, they were, in their own ways, extremely important and impressive leaders. You have a sense, therefore, of things that aren't important, that might be imagined to be. Put those aside. What you actually need, again and again, I found in the course of writing this book, and it's my 19th book, and when I was at Cambridge University, in fact, studying to try to get into Cambridge University in 1981, one of the subjects in the 3-hour paper that you had was, on this occasion at least, was how can one person lead 100? And in fact, I can't remember whether I took that answered that at the time, but in a sense, I've been spending the rest of my life trying to answer that question. And it is a fascinating one, and it doesn't just fit, of course, for 100 people, but also for 1,000 or 10,000, the numbers of soldiers that you are in charge of, and in huge countries like India and China, over hundreds of millions, even billions of people. What are these secrets? What are these techniques? And it strikes me that there are a whole number of them, and the ones that we assume, I think, are important. Ruthlessness, I'm afraid, however much one might not like to have to face the fact, is a tremendously important leadership skill. In the 9 people that I write about in this latest book that the General very kindly held up, albeit momentarily, who are Nelson, Napoleon, Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, Margaret Thatcher, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, President Eisenhower, George Marshall. You see the sense of ruthlessness come back again and again, not, of course, in the democratic leaders to anything like the degree that you get in the dictators, who are able, of course, to shoot people. But nonetheless, there is an element of the capacity, at least, for ruthlessness that comes back and again and again. Admiral Nelson in 1799 had some 300 Neapolitan Jacobins executed. It was basically today undoubtedly be considered a war crime, but in the standards of the day it wasn't. Napoleon in the same year, 1799, also executed over 3,000 Turkish artillerymen who had been caught 6 weeks previously in Gaza, fighting against the French state. They gave their parole, their promise not to do it again, and then they were caught 6 weeks later at Jaffa, and actually fighting against the French state, and he had them all executed. This is an example of the kind of ruthlessness that you see, I'm afraid, again and again, and sometimes has been proved to be absolutely necessary. It was taken, of course, to extraordinary limits by Stalin during the Second World War, who at one point in by the end of the siege of Stalingrad in February 1943, had shot 13,500 people, the size of an entire division in those days, for supposed cowardice. They were caught by the NKVD behind the lines and shot, 13,500 of them. An extraordinary example of ruthlessness. But then in that battle, you were sent forward without a rifle. You were expected to pick up the rifle of the dead man that you ran past. And so it did, of course, require the most extraordinary degree of courage, and anything less than that, it was considered by the Soviets at the time, was a reason for execution. Even in the democratic countries, you see ruthlessness, of course not on the same level by any means. Winston Churchill sacked general after general after general in the opening of the Second World War. Indeed, up until the Battle of El Alamein, he was still sacking them on a regular basis. George Marshall sacked, in the course of the Second World War, some 64 generals. It was a capacity, as I say, for ruthlessness that you see again and again in these leaders. There's also a capacity for dealing with setbacks, where they become something that you learn from. Winston Churchill made error after error, blunder after blunder in his career, and he learnt from all of them, even the most, indeed especially the most serious ones, such as, of course, the Dardanelles catastrophe in the Great War. And what he learnt from that was never to overrule the chiefs of staff in the course of the Second World War. He would shout at them sometimes, he would cry on occasion, he would make great speeches and so on, he would slam the table. But he never actually overruled all three of the chiefs of staff when all three of them agreed on a single course of action. And you see this with other leaders as well in the Second World War. I mentioned Stalin earlier. It's very interesting how he started the Second World War very much as you'd imagine a totalitarian dictator to begin, in that he believed that he was always right and he wouldn't listen to anybody. At the actual opening moment of Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, he had something akin to a mental breakdown, where he went back to his dacha outside Moscow, and he wouldn't see anybody for days. And indeed, when they came to him, when the Politburo came to him and asked him to be the overall commander, he thought that they had actually come along to arrest and execute him. And what he did during the course of the next few weeks and months, and indeed years of the Second World War, was to come away from the natural totalitarian dictatorial way of running wars and gave far more power to his marshals, to men like Zhukov and Rokossovsky and Konev, the great Russian marshals of the Second World War. He would allow them much more play when it came to strategy than hitherto. He was essentially adopting the Western view of interaction between politicians and generals. Whereas back at the Wolfschanze, 1,800 miles behind the front line at Stalingrad, the Führer was doing almost the exact opposite. He got more and more involved in the smaller and smaller aspects. There was one point in 1944 where he was actually moving around individual regiments in the course of the war in the East. I think it's very important to remember when considering the Second World War that for every 5 Germans killed in combat, by which I mean on a battlefield in the Second World War, 4 of them were killed on the Eastern Front. So what was going on there was absolutely central. And the way in which Hitler pulled back all the way through and, got more involved all the way through in smaller and smaller details, whereas Stalin was doing the exact opposite, I think is an absolutely fascinating aspect of their leadership. What you'd find is that that Hitler would listen to his generals who were far, far superior to him as strategists and indeed tacticians. Men like Gerd von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel, Heinz Guderian, and Erich Manstein, of course, perhaps the greatest of all the German generals in the Second World War. And he would listen to them for up to an hour. We know that because he had the stenographers from the time that he closed the Reichstag take down every word that was said at the Führer conferences. And then at the end of the meeting, he would go back to saying exactly what he'd originally said at the beginning. So that's a fascinating aspect of the way in which the two dictators changed during the course of the Second World War with regard to their relations with their generals. You'd actually find, going back to the concept of ruthlessness, that Stalin would indeed telephone his generals and threaten them with execution there and then if they were to pull back to particular positions. I mean, it was the most extraordinary way of running a war. And as I say, therefore, ruthlessness is an important aspect that one sees again and again. There's also a very interesting moment of self-realization, which each of these 9 leaders who I write about came to, usually in their mid to late 20s. There's a moment where something happens to them in that period that allows them to appreciate that they have in them the capacity for leadership. You see, of course, in Napoleon, the capturing of the bridge at Lodi in the Italian campaign in 1797. He's only 26 years old. He'd become a general 2 years earlier. And after capturing that bridge, and he then went on, of course, to capture Milan 2 days later, he was able to say, I'm so sorry, May 1796, not 1797, he was able to say of himself that that was the moment that he realized that he had the capacities for leadership. And you see it in all of the other leaders as well. For example, there is the moment in Churchill's life where he escapes from the prisoner of war camp in South Africa. He'd been captured in the South African War, and he was then imprisoned for 2 months, and then he escaped and crossed 300 miles of enemy territory over the next few days. And when he reached Durban, he was a hero right the way across the British Empire, a name across the world. And that was his moment. With Margaret Thatcher, it was the by-election in 1951 that she did incredibly well in. You see with Stalin, when he was 28, he robbed a bank and robbed the equivalent of $4 million from the Tiflis State Bank in a particularly violent robbery, which left 8 people dead. And he was treated with a great deal more respect by the Bolshevik leadership when he'd achieved that. Charles de Gaulle, of course, captured no fewer than 3 times during the First World War. He had the extraordinary experience of reading his own obituary, not once but twice. And that was one of the things that allowed him to appreciate his capacity for leadership. With both of the American generals, Eisenhower and Marshall, they both did extraordinarily well in their staff colleges. You have, therefore, just a series of moments that each in their 20s, these people were capable of leadership and recognized that in themselves. But then they also, all of them, had setbacks that they absolutely refused to allow to define them. They made mistake after mistake, many of them. Over half of the 9 people that I write about in this book actually spent time in prison. And these are major setbacks, and in each of them, they only allow it to strengthen them rather than to define them as a leader. You see quite often a defining sense of something larger than themselves that they are dedicating themselves to. These people are not just simply opportunists. Opportunism, of course, like any politician, does play a part. They certainly didn't turn down opportunities when they came. But there was a driving factor, something they stood for in each of their cases. With Napoleon, of course, the expanse of the successful parts, at least, of the French Revolution, equality before the law, the meritocracy, these great liberating concepts that the French Revolution unleashed, and he wanted to push them as far as they could possibly go geographically. With Hitler, obviously something much more sinister and evil in terms of the desire for Lebensraum and the concept of the master race. With Stalin, you had Marxist-Leninism, which he truly believed in. He saw as a form of religion in many ways. With Margaret Thatcher, the free enterprise, of course, and the concept of capitalism. So each of these people have something that drove them on. And in Marshall and Eisenhower's case, of course, it was also the concepts of democracy and freedom, which I know obviously is the driving concept behind NATO as well. And in each of these cases, they were willing, of course, under certain circumstances, to, as we say in English boxing expression, jab and weave. But nonetheless, underlying it, there was this ideological commitment to what they were standing for. What you also see, I think, on a larger scale, is a moment quite early on in their lives, usually when they're teenagers or adolescents, at least late adolescents, when they recognized that they were they took on their Weltanschauung, their overall world sense, and that I think is something that comes back again and again. They're able to appeal to their followers in a way that made what the people were doing, what their followers were doing, seem more important than just the normal things that the life was all about. When Napoleon was about to lead his army in the Battle of the Pyramids, he famously put out an order of the day saying, 40 centuries look down upon you. He's talking, of course, about the pyramids themselves, and he gave them a sense, therefore, of being able to go beyond themselves. This is a kind of demand for heroism. You see it a lot, of course, with Winston Churchill in the Second World War, in which he uses history. All of these people were interested in history. They believed in studying history. Churchill said, study history, for therein lies all the secrets of statecraft. And you get again and again this sense that with Churchill referring to Sir Francis Drake and Admiral Nelson, Hitler referred to Arminius, the great German hero, Churchill himself learning from Napoleon, and Napoleon learning from Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. This concept that you are not just fighting for the present day, but you're also bound up in a larger and wider concept. As Napoleon said, speak to the soul when he was about to give a speech for his troops. Some of them represented different aspects of leadership. With Nelson, it was just sheer aggression. Again and again, he was a man for the attack. He very rarely in his career ever had to defend at all. By and large, he was just a constant attack man, one attack after the other. And he was somebody who obviously ultimately paid the ultimate price at the Battle of Trafalgar. But his successes can be seen in terms of this ceaseless demand for a war of annihilation. Of course, much easier in Napoleonic warfare at sea to win battles of annihilation because, of course, people couldn't desert ships in the way that they could retreat or flee from battlefields on land. And so you do get an extraordinary series of victories that Nelson won by sheer constant attack. It was he was a predator, basically, fearless predator, and was capable. I'm not sure whether or not this is a message that you're necessarily going to want to hear, General, but capable of disobeying orders at the drop of a hat. If he thought that the order was the wrong one in the heat of battle, he took no notice of it. You see this at Copenhagen, but also earlier on in his career. But I hasten to add, I'm not by any means suggesting that should be...
During the leadership seminar, I quoted this passage of your book.
Thank you. With regard to Churchill, there was very much a sense that he was able to persuade people of something that they themselves really knew wasn't the case. In 1940, he told the British people that they were going to win the Second World War. There was simply no way in the May or June of 1940 that Britain was likely to be on the winning side. We'd been flung off the continent at Dunkirk, of course. France only had another few weeks left in the war. The Russians were allied to the Germans. The Americans were totally uninterested in getting into the war. And of course, it wasn't until Hitler declared war on America on the 11th of December 1941 that they did get into the war. And yet somehow Churchill was able to persuade people that it was worth continuing with that war. There were elements in the British government that wanted to explore peace negotiations with Adolf Hitler. And Churchill knew he had to outmaneuver these and to put forward argument after argument about how the war might be won, however unlikely they were. And yet being able to persuade people of something that ultimately seemed to make no sense at all was one of his extraordinary leadership abilities, and something that you see again and again come up. But again, not a charismatic figure. People said that they felt inspired by Winston Churchill, but they never used the word charisma for him. With Adolf Hitler, again and again, you see a weirdness, an extraordinary strangeness about the man. His leadership, it did have certain techniques and secrets of his leadership. He would never wear spectacles, for example, because he didn't want the people to know that he was short-sighted. His speeches, when you listen to his speeches, which I had to do when I was writing a book about Hitler 20 years ago, had to listen to, I don't know, it must have been about 30 hours of Hitler's speeches. The way in which the cadences work are completely fascinating. You have, when a Hitler speech, which usually goes on actually for as long as my speech is going to, about 35 to 40 minutes, what he does is to slowly build up the tempo of the speech. He actually starts to speak faster in the course of the speech, but you don't notice it over 40 minutes. The next thing he does is to build up the volume of the speech, which just gets louder and louder and louder. And again, because it's done over 40 minutes, it's impossible for you to notice. And he makes his sentences shorter and shorter. So at the end, the sentences are sometimes only 3 words long. But in the course of doing these 3 things, he's able to build his listeners up to a pitch, a frenzy, which is something that is completely the opposite of what most democratic politicians were doing, where they would use, like Churchill did, clauses and subclauses. Although, funnily enough, today you notice at the party conferences, at least in Britain, that in fact they're adopting the Hitlerian rather than the Churchillian form of speechifying, with the shorter sentences at the end. And this idea of how to speak, Hitler actually got from a comedian called Fürst Weigel. He would go along to this Munich comedian and take notes. He would sit in the front row of the audience. Must have been extremely off-putting for poor old comedian, having Adolf Hitler sit in the front row of your shows, taking notes rather than laughing at your jokes. And nonetheless, that was the thing that allowed him the sense of timing that he used. But the weirdness of the man comes over, I hope, in the book, because of all the various extremely weird beliefs, like how you can tell that that what dogs were thinking by looking at them. He had a hatred of English lawns. He believed that you could cure beriberi by eating potatoes. He believed that the Czechs came from Mongolia originally because of the shape of their moustaches. He would come up with weird concept after weird concept that would be beautifully all noted down by Martin Bormann, the Nazi Party secretary. And you very much recognise that were there such a thing as television interviews of the kind that we have today, there is simply no way that this man would have lasted 5 minutes. But nonetheless, he was fortunate enough to have existed in the era just before television. With Eisenhower, the concept of a man of good sense, of decency, a chairman of the board who was able to keep together some of the warring generals like Omar Bradley and Bernard Montgomery and George Patton, who all hated one another. That was an absolutely essential prerequisite for the kind of leadership that he had. He was under the most extraordinary pressures, needless to say. He was smoking 4 packets of cigarettes a day. He had a blood pressure of 176 over 110, stage 2 to hypertension, and yet was constantly being able to, with that quintessence of leadership that he had, to promote a sense of good, calm, and decency. When one thinks of the size of the forces under his control, with 91 divisions, 28,000 planes, nearly 1 million vehicles, 80 million tons of kit, it is quite an extraordinary thing that one man could have done so amazingly well. And he had behind him George Marshall, of course, who was a giant of organisation. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, the Americans had 200,000 men. It was about the same. It was the 16th largest army in the world, about the same size as Romania's. By the end, it had 16 million men and women in uniform. So to have organised that 80 times multiplication of the forces was a truly extraordinary ability of Marshall's. The sheer organisational capacity was something that would have daunted anybody, but he was able to do it. And I see that his concept of his leadership. With Charles de Gaulle, of course, for any Englishman to be talking about Charles de Gaulle at all is a minefield, frankly, because he was a superb, extraordinary Anglophobe. But that moment of his flying to France, from France to England in June 1940, the capacity that he showed for insisting on French greatness at a time when, to all and sundry, it seemed to have been broken. The way in which he personified the honour of France, I think, is again a truly extraordinary aspect of leadership, which it's always hugely enjoyable to write about. The jokes that Charles de Gaulle makes and the ones that are made about him make it always great fun. That sheer sense of sometimes truculence, really, that he had in demanding that France was great was in itself something that made France great. So you have, therefore, and again and again, and with Napoleon, almost all of the great leadership traits are to be found in Napoleon. He lost, of course, the attack on Russia, which was ultimately to cost him 500,000 men, was the thing that brought him down 3 years later, to all intents and purposes. But nonetheless, when it comes to his leadership techniques, and I go into it on at the end of my chapter in this book on leadership. Really, he is the one who we see almost all of the great leadership capacities in one person, despite the obvious ironic fact that ultimately he was defeated. He believed in glory and distinction and rewards. But he also was able to be pretty harsh to his listeners and to his troops and his men. He never went over the top when it came to the glory and rewards. He did have a fantastic way of enthusing the troops. He would always make sure when they bivouacked at night that the sentries were the first ones to have the wine. He would always let even the smallest and youngest drummer boys sit around the campfire. He would have his own medal put on a pin, so if he saw somebody in a battle being particularly brave, he would be able to ride up to him and take off his own Legion of Honor and hand it to the soldier. There were any number of sort of techniques of leadership which Napoleon had, as well as the grand strategic concept. I think that when it came to the invasion of Russia, it's very important to remember with Napoleon that the plan was not to go to Moscow. It was to fight within 50 miles of the Russian border over only a 20-day period. He was drawn in, of course, by the Russians, but the overall plan, he attacked Russia. He crossed the river Niemen on the 22nd of June, 1812, with some 615,000 men, which was the same size as Paris at the time, easily the biggest city in Europe. Well over twice the size of the Russian army, and he wasn't to know, of course, that he was going to lose ultimately 100,000 men of his central striking force to typhoid, typhus, which was a disease that wasn't actually diagnosed until 1911, nearly 100 years later. And so although it seems to us, of course, insane to have considered invading Russia, at the time, it actually, although he did have Charles XII's of Sweden's invasion of Russia before him, 100 years before him, that he studied, we shouldn't necessarily see it in the same way that we do with Hitler's invasion of Russia, not least because, of course, Napoleon did get to Moscow and allowed enough time. He allowed more time to get back from Moscow to Sebastopol to Smolensk than he had allowed to get from Smolensk to Moscow. What went wrong was that on the 25th of October 1812, he fought the Battle of Maloyaroslavets, and although he won it, the direct route back to France seemed to be blocked. As it turned out, it wasn't blocked by the Russian army, but it seemed to be. And so he made the disastrous decision of taking the dogleg back via the battlefield of Borodino. So to conclude, I'd just like to mention a few of Winston Churchill's. Of all of these people, the person I'd like to mention some of the leadership techniques, the sort of tricks of the trade that Churchill had, owing to the fact that they, I think some of them still might have some use today. With regard to COVID-19, of course, he himself had to face two devastating influenza attacks. The Russian flu of 1891 to 1892 killed 1 million people. He was a schoolboy at the time. His only poem that he ever wrote in his life was entitled Influenza, and it was about the influenza outbreak. It's a rather good poem. I do recommend it to you. And then, of course, he was the Secretary of State for War, in charge of demobilizing the army at the end of the Great War in 1918 and 1919, at the same time as the Spanish flu of that time, which was to kill, historians argue, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people at that stage. His family caught the flu. He lost friends to it. So I think COVID-19 would have been something that he would have recognized. And I'm afraid in the Second World War, something that he would almost certainly have died of. He was in his 70s, he was a smoker, he had very serious underlying health condition, not least the 4 attacks of pneumonia that he suffered between when he was in Tripoli, the first one in November 1943 and the last one in February 1945. And he, at one point, they had to fly 6 doctors from Cairo to Tunis and an X-ray machine because his life was on the line there. So with regard to this, his stance would have been, I think, very much the same one as the much more visible enemy of the Luftwaffe was constant resilience. He did listen to his scientists. He was close friends with many of his scientists, Professor Lindemann, R.V. Jones being the classic examples. He didn't much listen to his doctors, owing to the fact that he drank all the way through his convalescence from pneumonia. He was told not to drink, but nonetheless, we have his nurses' fluid intakes, and they include 10 ounces of champagne, 2 ounces of brandy, and 8 ounces of whiskey and soda every day. But nonetheless, overall, he was somebody who he said of experts that they should be on tap but not on top, and that was his stance there. So his sort of tricks of the trade were, first of all, always to be in the key place at the key moment. He was somebody who would go up onto the roof of the Air Ministry during the Blitz in London, but all the way through his life, he tried to make sure that he was always at the key point. Of course, he was prevented from going to the beaches of D-Day in June 1944, where he got there as soon as he could after that. But otherwise, he was constantly trying to be in the important place at the important time. He found being interested in small things, what we might consider trivial things, to be important as well. He was constantly sending off messages telling the First Lord of the Admiralty that the flag over the Admiralty was looking too tattered and they needed a new one, and so on. He would even send messages to say whether or not sailors on ships should be playing drafts or cards and things like that seem not to matter at all, but he was always extremely keen on ensuring that morale was kept high. he wrote down his worries. This was something that he learned to do when he was Home Secretary in the early part of the 20th century. And he wrote down his worries, which he said that if you put them in order, once you've written them down, you put them in order, what you notice is that some of the things that you're worried about, you shouldn't be, and other things that you aren't really worried about, you should be. And that they necessarily, once you've actually got them in front of you on a piece of paper in order, it helps to work out for yourself what you should genuinely be spending your time worrying about. He didn't believe in taking holidays. In the whole of the Second World War, he only took 8 days off, and on each of those, he also kept reading his red boxes. He told his staff to have a busy Christmas and a frantic New Year. That's not necessarily something that we could stick to today, but nonetheless, he never considered himself at all to be entirely off work. He also did something that he called his nightly court-martial, which was that every night before he went to sleep, he would court-martial himself and consider what his opponents, his enemies, might say about him as a critique of what he had done that day. So he actually had a daily critique that meant that he was able to concentrate on what he thought he was bad at, which is an interesting aspect of Churchillian leadership. The next one is Swedish milk punch. He would every fortnight bring together all his most important people in his staff and people who he knew didn't know each other. So he'd bring in people from the Treasury to meet people from the Air Ministry, people from the Admiralty to meet people from the Income Tax Office. So people who, under normal circumstances, wouldn't ever get to meet. He would bring together once a fortnight key people to drink what I must admit I think sounds absolutely disgusting, which is Swedish milk punch. I'm sure it would work with other drinks as well. The next thing he did, was to, yes, it was a wonderful phrase that he came up with in 1937 when he was speaking to his godson, giving him a gold watch indeed for his Christmas present, the Duke of Marlborough. And he said to him, never confuse popularity with leadership. This was something that you saw again and again in the 1930s. He didn't court unpopularity, of course not, no politician does, but he never mistook the two. He thought it was tremendously important to say unpopular things if he believed them. And this, of course, was very unpopular in the 1930s. He was shouted down in the House of Commons. He was nearly deselected for his seat in Parliament. He was lambasted in the press and ridiculed. But nonetheless, by 1940, when the unpopular things that he had been saying had all come to pass, it worked tremendously well for him, needless to say, and he would never have become Prime Minister under any other circumstances than that. So you have, therefore, I think, a series of leadership techniques, not just from him, but from these other people. But if I was to really wind them all up into one, the most important one, I think again and again you come back to Napoleon's. I wish I had my book with me because there's a paragraph I'd love to read to you about Napoleon's leadership. But what I think comes through more than anything else is this concept of what Napoleon said was electrifying the men by speaking to the soul. That's really the key of it, it strikes me. Thank you very much indeed.